When it comes to making decisions, we tend to focus on two. How quickly can we make them, or how right can we make them? But in reality, there's often a trade-off between the two, and our tendency is to always pick one or the other. For example, if you were an executive at a major corporation, you might be inclined to hire the most qualified candidate for an open position. That might take months of interviews and background checks, though, during which time the role sits vacant and the business could suffer. In that case, you might choose to rush the hiring process, accepting that you might miss out on the perfect fit, in favor of getting someone in the door more quickly. Compare this to a small business owner who has just a few $1,000s to spend on advertising. She wants to get the biggest possible return on her investment, so she spends weeks researching the best advertising platform for her product, running test ads and analyzing the results before finally settling on a strategy. By taking her time, she was able to maximize the effectiveness of her ads, but she could have gotten them up and running much faster had she just guessed and pulled the trigger. So how do you know which approach to take when faced with this choice? Well, first you need to know what's at stake. How costly is it to make the wrong decision? Consider your advertising budget. If you were to guess at the best platform for your ads and end up spending your entire budget without any return on investment, you would essentially be out of business. You couldn't afford to keep guessing. But let's say you were launching a new product instead. While it would be disappointing to waste thousands of dollars on a dud, you could probably afford to take a couple of guesses and still stay afloat. In this scenario, you could afford to take your time to get it right. Now consider how long it would take to correct a wrong decision in each scenario. With the advertising campaign, once you realize that your ads aren't performing well, you can pivot and try something else. But it's too late then. You've already wasted your money and missed out on potential customers. On the other hand, if you were launching a new product and made a mistake, it might take months or even years to realize there was an issue. For instance, one company spent millions of dollars developing a new smartphone only to find out that no one wanted it. They could have tested the product with potential customers throughout the development process, but they didn't. The risk in this scenario was just too high. In situations like these, rushing a decision can have catastrophic consequences. So it makes sense to take your time and get it right. So how do you decide whether or not you can afford to take your time? Well, it starts with understanding what is at stake and how long it would take to correct a wrong decision. And then you need to consider how likely it is that you'll actually make the wrong decision. When the stakes are high and the likelihood of making a wrong decision is also high, it doesn't make sense to cut corners. For example, if you're making a large investment, it's worth doing your due diligence, even if it takes longer when the potential payoff is so great. The risks are just too high to ignore. But if you're investing a relatively small amount, then it might be worth just pulling the trigger and seeing what happens. In this case, the cost of making a wrong decision is low enough that it wouldn't be catastrophic. Plus, you'll gain valuable insights from the experience that you can use to improve your future decisions. Let's look at another example. Let's say you're trying to decide whether or not to break off your engagement. If you continue with the wedding, you might be stuck in a bad marriage. But if you break off the engagement, you might never find anyone else as good as your fiancé. Now, this is obviously an extreme example, but it illustrates the point. When the stakes are this high, the cost of making the wrong decision are just too great. It doesn't make sense to rush such an important choice. Instead, take your time, weigh your options, and make the best decision you can. However, when the stakes are lower, it can make sense to speed things up. For example, let's say you're trying to decide where to go on vacation. If you choose the wrong destination, you might have a few extra hours of travel time, or maybe you won't get to see all the attractions you want to see. But ultimately, it's not the end of the world. In this case, it doesn't make sense to spend weeks or even days agonizing over the decision. Instead, you could just pick a place and book your trip. Once you've arrived, you can relax and enjoy yourself knowing that you made the best decision you could with the information you had at the time. Of course, this isn't an either-or proposition. There are degrees of right and degrees of fast. Sometimes you need to make a fast decision because the stakes are high. Other times you need to make a right decision because the stakes are high. And sometimes you need to strike a compromise between the two. For example, let us say you're a parent trying to decide whether or not to let your kid get a piercing. If you say yes, your kid will be happy in the short term, but you might regret it later on down the line if they end up getting an infection or worse. You might just think they're too young to make that kind of decision. On the other hand, if you say no, your kid might be upset in the short term, but they'll probably understand and respect your decision in the long run. In this case, it makes sense to find a compromise, such as waiting until your kid is older or finding a less risky alternative, such as getting their ears pierced at a professional studio. Ultimately, the goal is to make the best decisions possible as quickly as possible. That means being aware of the potential consequences of a wrong decision and being willing to take our time when necessary. But it also means being able to quickly make decisions when the stakes are lower. In today's fast-paced world, we're constantly being bombarded with decisions both big and small. It's important to remember that we don't need to have all the answers all the time. Sometimes it's okay to take our time and get it right. And sometimes it's better to make a quick decision and move on. Ultimately, it's up to us to decide what's most important in each situation. So next time you need to make a decision, ask yourself, is it worth taking my time to get it right, or can I afford to be wrong? Now, speaking of making decisions, have you ever been torn between two job offers? One job pays more but requires you to move to a new city. The other pays less but allows you to stay in your current home. Which should you choose? Well, it depends on what's important to you. If you value your career more than anything else, then you should take the job that pays more. However, if you value your current location more, then you should take the job that pays less. There's no right or wrong answer. It all depends on your individual circumstances and what you want to prioritize. That's why it's important to know yourself well and what you want out of your career before you start interviewing. Once you have a clear understanding of your goals, it'll be easier to make decisions about where to live and work. Okay, now it's time to hear from you. What do you think is more important in life? Making fast decisions or making right decisions? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe for more content like this in the future. Thanks for watching.